Good evening. Tonight we're going to talk about memory retrieval. So once the memories are in there, we talked about storage last night, how do we get them out again? How do we retrieve them from our memory banks? Alright, so there's a couple different types of retrieval. We talked about them briefly in class. So these are the 3 R's: recall, recognition, and relearning. So recall is when some people, through practice, visual strategies, or biological differences, they have the ability to store and recall thousands of words or digits, reproducing them years later. This is like the fill in the blank, where you're just bringing it out of your memory with nothing in front of you to sort of elicit that from you. Recognition is a little bit different. This is like the multiple choice, where you're choosing from a bunch of different selections. And we demonstrated this in the 7 Dwarfs activity. So the average person can view 2,500 new faces and places, and later can notice with 90% accuracy which ones they've seen before. So once you've seen it before, or you have them in front of you to choose from, I think it's a bit easier. But nonetheless, these are different types of retrieval. And relearning is a little bit different. So some people are unable to form new memories, especially of episodes. And although they would not recall a puzzle-solving lesson, they might still solve the puzzle faster each lesson. So relearning is basically when you forget how to do something, or you forget something, but you know you did it in the past, and you have to relearn how to do it. It's what the name suggests. So we can learn some things from these different types of retrievals. Our storage and our recall capacity is virtually unlimited, as you saw those people in the video that remembered every single day of their lives. They don't seem to be overloaded with information. In fact, they're adding new information every single second of their lives. And also, our capacity for recognition is greater than our capacity for recall. That's important, and that's probably why it's a bit easier. And relearning can highlight that memories are there even if we can't recall forming them. And this is this automatic processing that we were talking about. So relearning time is considered a measure of retention, meaning the quicker you're able to relearn something, that means that you retain the information to a greater degree. So this was discovered by our old friend Hermann Ebbinghaus, and he studied how many times does it take to relearn and regain mastery of material. So he studied the memorization of nonsense syllables, and you see a couple listed there, so that the depth processing or pre-learning would not be a factor, meaning that they had no meaning, they were nonsensical. So he found that the more times he rehearsed out loud on day 1, the less time he needed to relearn and memorize the same letters on day 2. So there was more retention the more he rehearsed. So, and there you see the graph. As rehearsal increases, relearning time decreases. So the more you rehearse, the easier it is to relearn. Very simple. Priming. So this is a retrieval technique. So we see this statement here: retrieval is affected by our activating our associations. What does that mean? So we talked about how memories aren't just individual files like on a computer, but rather it's a complex web that's intermingling and interconnected. And so what this priming does is it triggers a thread of association, so a web of different ideas that are linked together through meaning. And so it triggers a thread of associations that brings us to a concept, just as a spider feels movement in a web and follows it to find a bug. So our mind works by having one idea trigger another. This maintains the flow of thought. So when you think of something, automatically everything that's associated with that is right there with it, because it's important for our thinking in the world. So let's do a little experiment. Define the word bark. Got it? All right. Now, what is the definition of the word bark? So the first time, you probably said tree bark. Why do you think that was so? Because you were staring at an image of tree bark for a bit. The second time, you may have said it is the sound that a dog makes, because you were primed by the image of the dog. That's how priming works. So I would probably bet that advertising uses a bit of this to get you to buy stuff. We'll get into that later on in the year. So priming is very powerful. So it's been called the invisible memory because it affects us unconsciously. So in the case of the tree bark versus the dog bark, the path we follow in our thoughts can be channeled by priming. So think of what it's like to prime some sort of motor device. You press this thing and it primes it, and then it's ready to go. So in this case, you're priming your memory to think a certain way by forming and activating associations. But we may have biases and associations stored in our memory that also influences our choices, so we have to be aware of those. So these are just a couple of studies that demonstrated the power of priming. So people primed with money-related words were less likely to help another person. Interesting. Priming with an image of Santa Claus led kids to share more candy. He's always watching. It's kind of creepy. Another study said that people primed with a missing child poster then misinterpreted ambiguous adult interactions as kidnapping. Also interesting. So that's the power of priming. Wherever your mind is in the moment, that determines how you'll encode the memory, or what memories you're retrieving in the moment as well. So with that being said, memory is largely context dependent, meaning that part of the web of associations of a memory is the context. What else was going on at the time we formed the memory? So when we retrieve a memory more easily in the same context as when we formed the memory. So basically, the external surroundings that we're involved in when we're making the memory will allow the memory to be retrieved easily. So if you put yourself in a similar context that you were in when you made the memory, it will be easier to recall the memory. So did you forget a psychology concept? Just sitting down and opening your book might bring the memory back. Or another example, maybe a couple nights ago you forgot something that I said in the lecture, but you think in your mind, oh, that was the lecture Mr. Becker was wearing that funny hat. So if you just picture in your mind's eye me in the funny hat and the little box on the screen, that might trigger your memory because it's context dependent. Right? So not only are memories context dependent, but they're also state dependent, meaning it's not just dependent on what's out there in the world, but it's also dependent on what's going on inside of your head. What emotional state is going on at that time that you're making the memory. And the cartoon right there, it's get cut off, I realize that, but it says, I can't remember what we were arguing about either. Let's just keep yelling and maybe it will come back to us. So, signifying, let's get into the same emotional state that we got into when we started arguing, and then the memories will be triggered. So our memories are not just linked to the external context, as I said. Memories can also be tied to the emotional state we were in when we formed the memory. So this idea of mood-congruent memory refers to the tendency to selectively recall details that are consistent with one's current mood. And this biased memory then reinforces our current mood. So it's secular. And lastly, we have this idea of the serial position effect. I touched on this briefly in class. So priming and context cues are not the only factors which make memory retrieval selective. The serial position effect refers to the tendency when learning information in a long list to more likely recall the first items, which is called the primacy effect, and the last items, the regency effect. So the idea is that when you're getting ready to remember stuff, you're ready when the list starts and you remember the first stuff, and then the stuff at the end is the most recent stuff, so you remember that too. The stuff in the middle just kind of gets lost. And so here we have a graph depicting the serial position effect. Alright, I believe that is it for this evening. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you tomorrow.